In the first weeks back, Warsaw was empty and hot. We walked the bright avenues and bought berries and sunflowers hats from the old ladies and ate them at the Saski Gardens near me. By the hill with the wide pavilion, we stopped at milk bars. We ate cool chodnik soup, the sour milk and pink beetroot soothing our throats. We drank fruit compote, which colored our tongues, and for dessert, noodles with melted butter and raspberry jam. Later, full and content, we'd lie in the high grass near the zoo in Praga and watch the sky through the gaps in the solid branches of the trees above. Our words, our stories, poured forth like springs. I told you about Mother and Granny, and even about Father. How he'd left us when I was very young. How I could barely remember him. How I barely wanted to. He'd moved to Calais and never visited. And all we saw of him were the merge alimony payments and postman brought every month. Mother always said he'd never wanted children, that he'd wanted her all to himself, to love and control. You listened, really listened, gentle talking to me in without judgment, making me feel more heard than I knew I could be. Then you told me about your family in the mountains, about your brothers, whom you had looked up to as a boy, and who'd become nothing, drunks like so many others, passing out every payday, whose bodies the police picked up from the benches and pavements and left overnight in the sobering cells. You talked about your parents and their work in the sawmill, how ignorant they were of you. They hardly know what this means, you said, looking around the city. I want to show them. They can be proud of me. You told me about your job, starting a week from then, for the Office of Pest Control. You half whispered, as if pronouncing the name of a god. A shiver ran through me, made me forget it was summer. You mean the Office of Censorship? I said, despising you for a moment. The ones who ban the books we need the most? Irritation flickered across your face. Don't be such a square. Everyone's gotta start somewhere. You have a better idea? Let's go away, I said, surprised by the boldness of this. But you only looked amused. Where would you like to go? Rome, Paris? I'm not joking, Janusz. You know what, Lucio? You're a crazy one. Look around you. We were protected by the high grass, the sun shining on us. Why would we leave all this? That evening, we took the elevator to the top of the Palace of Culture and saw the city lying before us. Its vastness suddenly tiny, its end, the chimneys of the factories and the forest behind the last houses. A secret resolved. The Wisla snaked itself through the middle, continued on beyond the human-made structures, toward the mountains in the south and the sea to the north. The mist of the day's heat dissolved above the blocks. Summer was at its height. Time was suspended, and I never wanted to run again. Like a dice, spinning and spinning without ever coming to a standstill. The weeks passed, and I hadn't seen Carolina since the camp. I decided to visit her. She rented a room from a crane driver in Olibors, in the far north of the city. The only part Bovia had ever seen. When his train stopped on the way from Moscow to Berlin. Just a couple of years before you and I met. It made him write Warsaw, a terribly desolate song. But Olibos isn't the worst neighborhood by far. It's residential, made up of 1930s Bauhaus-style flats and a run-down garden city. There are trees everywhere, large and oblivious, and carpets of grass occupy every space between the grey buildings. In summer, it's a two-colored word, grey and green. But of course, Bowie saw it all in winter, when there's only one color left. I knocked on Carolina's door. The crane driver opened it, wearing curls in her hair and a dressing gown around her barrel-like body. She knew me, although she never showed any sign of it. With a dry good morning, she led me along the corridor, which was decorated with empty packets of Western cigarettes, Camel Ambassador, Marlboro, arranged on a shelf. She led me towards Carolina's room at the far end of the flat and knocked on her door before I could. Her curlers shook in her short hair. "Miss Patoka?" she cried. "Another man for you." She threw me a satisfied look and walked off. The door opened and Carolina's face appeared, breaking into a smile. "Lucio, it's you!" She kissed me on both cheeks, her blouse soft against my bare upper arm. "Come in, close the door." She walked across the room, picking up clothes that were lying strewn on the floor, the chair of her desk, the bed, and pushed them into a wardrobe in the corner. "Never mind the mess," she said, throwing herself onto her bed and looking at me wide-eyed. "I didn't expect you, but I'm glad you came. Sit." With her palm, she tapped the space next to her. I obeyed. I hope she wasn't too mean. She looked at the door and rolled her eyes. She hasn't become any more refined. "Did you hear how she tries to humiliate me?" "As if that could humiliate you," another gentleman caller. She smiled, her collar-colored lips stretching over her big teeth. "So, how have you been?" She looked at me for a moment, as if reading me. "You've changed," she said calmly, like a clairvoyant announcing someone's fate. "Have I?" I made a grimace. "Your face." She held her hand to it, her middle finger resting on my cheekbone. "It looks like something's opened up, something that was folded tight, like a fist. I'd never noticed before, but now I do." "You can save your wise words for one of your gentleman callers." I laughed gently, pushing her hand away. "I'm the same." She shrugged, getting up from the bed and sitting down at her desk, which also functioned as her dressing table with a mirror on the wall. A photo of Isabel Adjani was stuck between the mirror's frame and its glass. A still from Polanski's The Tenant. Adjani looked wrapped behind an enormous pair of tortoise-shell glasses. Her big and frizzy, ring-covered fingers seductively placed by her lips. Carolina picked up the pair of tweezers and started plucking an eyebrow. She was sitting with her back to me. In the reflection of the mirror, she looked startled and concentrated, her gaze moving from her brows to the photo to me. Don't make me pull every word out of you individually. What was it like with him? She never called you by your name. Good, I said, shrugging, trying to sound natural as I could. We camped by a lake, swam, fished. It was fun. She ran the tip of her ring finger along the brow she had been working on and moved one to the other. I had no idea you two were friends. She sounded absent-minded, but I sensed her disinterest was feigned. He asked me on the last night in the forest, I said, shrugging, and we weren't really friends. He had no one to go with, and I had nothing to do, so I thought I might just as well. She stopped what she was doing, and her eyes moved over me in the mirror. You know you can tell me, she said softly. Her words ran through me like a string pulled tight. There's nothing to say, I said, looking at her for a moment, and then turning to the window. There was a silence, and in its place I tried to decide whether my sudden anger was with her or with myself, for being unable to speak the truth. Through the door, we heard a radio playing, a marching hand blasting out a tune with insistent joy. What's new with you? I made myself ask. Me? She continued plucking. Your friend here got herself a job. What? That's great. She set down her tweezers, took a cigarette from a packet on the desk, lit it, and quickly blew the smoke through her nostrils. The tips of her fingers were blackened from the soot of her cheap Romanian snaghouse. As a secretary to some asshole in the Ministry of Justice, she sounded like a judge announcing someone's prison sentence. Matter of fact, a little gleeful. I was taken aback. What about the placement? Weren't you going to train with the divorce lawyers? No vacancies. She blew out smoke with her head lowered, staring at the carpet. I could see her eyelashes pointing towards the floor. Turns out I had no chance of getting anywhere without connections. Whenever my grades... Who was I fooling anyway? She sighed, lifting her head. Her sad eyes glazed mine for an instant, and then she turned her head towards the window. But maybe it's better this way. I don't know. Maybe I would have hated it. I might apply again next year. I nodded, tried to seem encouraging. Yes, you will. This is just temporary. She nodded, as if she was trying to believe me. So what's it like? I asked. She shrugged, took a deep drag. I only started last week. Don't ask me what they actually do in that office. I get the counselor his vodka in the morning and type up a letter or two in the afternoon. Other than that, he treats me like a showpiece for his colleagues. He asked me to wear a tight sweater more often. So much for my 4 years of higher education. She took an ashtray from her desk and crushed the half-finished cigarette. I smoke too much, she muttered, placing the ashtray on the table, trying to smile at me. Come here. I patted the empty space beside me on the bed. She obeyed. Her head sank onto my shoulder, and I slung my arm around her. We sat like this for a while, seeing ourselves in the mirror, searching for something in our own reflections. I'm sorry, I whispered finally. Oh, don't be. It never turns out the way we think it will. And anyway, I was once one of the lucky ones. At least I have permission to stay in the city now that we've graduated. Otherwise, they would have sent me straight back to Tichy. And God knows what I'd be doing there. Living with my parents. She straightened and tried to laugh. I'm just not sure I'll be able to take it for long. You won't have to, I said. I'm sure of it. Yeah? There was doubt in her eyes, a need for reassurance. I nodded and took her into my arms. Her body was like a furnace. I almost felt like I was burning myself. It swallows you up, all your thoughts, all your self-respect, I said, with a note of despair. I had rarely heard her voice. I can already see myself becoming one of those bitter office ladies. You won't become one of those, I said, taking her by the shoulders and looking her straight in the eyes. I'll make sure of it. Not while I'm alive. She smiled and released me. See, you have changed, she said. You've become an optimist. She stood and walked over to the window. Branches of blindingly green leaves rocked in the breeze, slowly, peacefully. She opened the window and stood there for a moment, looking out, breathing in deeply. And you? Have you figured out what you will do with yourself, Lucio? I've had some time to think this summer, I said, hyper-aware of my voice. I was looking at my hands, assembling my words. I think I'll try for a doctorate after all. You know, the one Professor Milevich said I should do. She turned around slowly, her face immobile. Really? I shrugged, meeting her eyes for a moment. They were hard and vulnerable at the same time. What made you change your mind? I thought about it again. The allowance from my father will run out soon, and I have to do something. This might be better than rotting away in some school or library. No? You once said you'd rather work in a factory than sell out. I bit my lip. Well, that wasn't true, was it? I said, trying to smile. And what about the topic? What if they make you write about what they want? I shrugged again harder. I'll find a way around it. Or not. She nodded, turning back to the window, putting her hands on a sill. I got up and joined her there. Beyond the branches, in the houses across the street, clothes hang from the lines strung outside the windows. The fabric of people's lives drying in the sun, swaying with the wind. Large dresses in faded reds and mustard yellow shirts with stiff collars that resembled obese men whenever a gush of wind filled their interior. Towels rubbled down over the years. In the street, Girls in knee-high white socks had drawn boxes on the ground with chalk. Were counting and singing, jumping one-legged from hell to heaven. I was serious when I said we can always leave, she said, lifting her head towards me. You know that, right? My uncle in Chicago could find us something. Or we could book a bus tour to Germany or France and just get off and run away. She smiled, somehow sadly. There's no need to rush into anything, I said, feeling the weight of her stare. We always said we'd try our chances here first. Maybe things will get better. Nothing ever gets better here, she said, closing the window and walking back to her bed. We don't know that yet. Do we not? She looked at me with curiosity. I guess you still need to find that out for yourself. The next day, I walked out to the old town along the New World Promenade. Novi Viat, with the cafes and busy shops, past the church where Chopin's heart is buried in a pink marble column, and where the students rioted in 1968 and were beaten by the police. I walked through the iron entrance gate of the university into the faculty grounds. It was strange to come here in the middle of summer, before term had begun. Empty lanes and empty lawns, and the large shade-giving trees, no one underneath them. The library deserted, but for a couple of researchers. The place took me aback. I felt like a ghost as I passed through the literature department, the corridor that echoed every single one of my steps. I knocked on the thick door that said, Professor Milevich. I could hardly believe it when my knock was answered with a, Come in. As usual, the professor was sitting in his armchair, surrounded by stacks of books, papers piled before him like the unsteady skyscrapers of a conjured-up city. He was a round man of about 50, with dark hair he combed back over his large head, an affable, expensive face with round glasses. Pan Grovatsky said, What a pleasure to see you. He said this calmly, as if somehow he'd known I'd come that very day. Have a seat. He closed the book he was reading, slipping a pen between the pages. You've come because of the doctorate, isn't that right? He smiled knowingly. I nodded. Yes, Professor. You want to do it then? He looked at me intently, almost too directly. It made me feel see-through. Yes, Professor, I said, this time a little less assured. Good. He smiled and leaned back, taking off his glasses and rubbing his eyes as if he was wiping something away. You know what you're getting yourself into. I hesitated. Not really, sir. He laughed, deep and bearish, but I want to try. That's the right attitude. He leaned forward and put his chunky arms on the desk, his fingertips touching one another. Because I cannot guarantee anything, you see. Ultimately, the board needs to accept your proposal, and they're a tough bunch. He turned sideways in his chair, bent over, rummaged in the drawer. Finally, he pulled out a thin stack of papers. Here, fill these out, and bring me a proposal by the end of the week. We'll look it over together. Before he handed me the papers, he threw a careful look at the door, then back at me. He spoke with a lowered voice, a soft of thought-through whisper. I need hardly tell you what that conditions are. Something that won't be too upsetting, you see. He made a wave-like gesture with his hand. Nothing controversial, nothing remotely anti-socialist, no whiff of pro-Westernism, my dear. Recently, they've been getting increasingly nervous about that sort of thing. I understand, I said, taking the papers from him. We shook hands, and I turned to leave. And Ludwig? I turned back round. He was looking at me with an almost parental concern. Make sure it's good, all right? There are always candidates. I want you to get this. I nodded and left his office, shutting the door behind me with trembling hands. Standing in the empty corridor, I let out a deep breath. Swimming in the Dark. Chapter 4. Night fell particularly early today. The outside, the city glimmers across the other side of the river like a sequined dress of steel. I was hungry when I got home and decided to make a sandwich. The bread is white and already sliced. Over here, and all you have to do is chew. I buttered the bread and sprinkled sugar on it. It's not the same as home, but it did the trick. Then I picked up the phone and dialed Granny's number. The signal was still busy. It's been like that for days. I tried not to worry and wrote her a letter instead, asking how she was. Of course they will open and read it before she does. But I no longer care. After that, I switched on the TV. The news is getting worse. They're hunting down the opposition, arresting the key figures of Solidarno, dispersing the underground, hunting down trade union leaders, probably torturing them, said the presenter, her pretty face matter of fact. I believe it. I don't want to, but I cannot help myself. I wonder, are you involved? That's the question that follows me around like a shadow. Would you still defend the party now? Maybe the worst thing is that I have no one to speak to. No one who'd open the window on this stale air of speculation. I know that eventually I will need to find someone to trust. At the office, they ask me how I am every day, about a dozen times. It took me a while to understand why they were so baffled by my attempts to answer, to understand that my answer isn't the point, that asking is. So now I say that I'm fine. I even attempt to smile. But I sense that either way, my foreignness somehow absolves me from their judgment. To them, I must explain my strange list completely. When I was still a child, Mother and Granny would lock themselves in my mother's room every evening. I never knew what they were doing in there, and they never allowed me in. Whenever I asked, they say I wasn't old enough to know. And you mustn't tell anyone we do this, Mother would say, crouching down to my level and placing her large hard hands on my shoulders. You understand? No one. If you do, something bad might happen to us. Her face was tense, the deep worry lines above her brows making her look spent. Are you doing something bad? I asked, scared. No, my darling, her voice mellowed. But even when you don't do bad things can happen to you. Why? She tried to look soft, but the lines on her forehead didn't disappear altogether. This is how it is. They didn't say anything more. No matter how much I begged, I would put my ear to the door, but all I could hear was very low, sort of crackling, indistinguishable voices. I couldn't see anything. The keyhole was filled with the key. Much later, they'd emerge from the room, talking in urgent, hushed voices, sometimes sad, sometimes almost joyful. And though I was used to their nightly ritual, it still frustrated me to be excluded from its secret. The day I learned that Baniak and his family had gone, my mother came home and found me in my room, wrapped into myself, crying. She must have known this was serious because I didn't cry often, and when she asked me what was the matter, tears choked my words. She sat on the bed and I put head on her lap. The material of her skirt cool against my cheek. Her arms around me. I continued to cry, encouraged by her comfort, letting the tears out there where no one left. She stroked my hair, and then I had calmed down. I told her I had gone to Baniak, how the strange woman had opened the door, and what the lady from church had said. Why did they leave? I asked. Will they come back? I could see indecision in her eyes. Before she could speak, Granny appeared in the door, as if she'd been listening all along. I think he's old enough now, she said, looking at my mother gravely. He needs to know. Mother looked from her to me, silent for a moment. Ludzio, you won't say anything, will you? I shook my head, suddenly jerked out of my sadness. She looked at her watch. Come on, then. We went in her room, where Granny closed the door behind us and shut the window and drew the curtains. It was still light outside, and children were playing heaven and hell in the street below, hopping and skipping across the pavement. First of all, you need to be quiet, said Granny, pointing at the wall we shared with the neighbors. And don't ask any questions until it's over. Just listen. She walked over to the dresser and lifted the protective cover of the radio, revealing its compact body, the dark, smooth wood glistening in the light. We placed 3 chairs around it and sat down. Mother pushed the black button and carefully adjusted the indicator. At first, there was nothing but low crackling. Then there was music, a flute playing a jolly tune. Then the music ended, and I could feel Mother's and Granny's bodies tense. A voice began to speak. This is Radio of Free Europe, broadcasting live from Munich, West Germany. News at 8 o'clock, Monday, the 21st of June, 1968. The man's voice was different from the voices that usually come out of the radio. It was calmer, less aggressive. He wasn't shouting or proclaiming. Mother and Granny sat frozen, their hands holding out their chins and covering their mouth. I tried to concentrate like them, but I didn't understand much of what was said. He used many words I didn't know, acronyms that meant nothing to me. It was like another language. At one point he mentioned Israel, those jagged syllables that had become so potent in only a day. I tried to guess the meaning of it all, but only saw blanks. When the program was over, Mother moved the indicator back to another station and tuned up the volume. This, I discovered, is what she would do every night, so no one would ever know they had listened to the forbidden station. And while the music played, they began to explain. They explained about the Jews, that there had been many in Poland before, for 1,000 years, that most had been killed in the camps that the Germans had set up during the war. Granny recalled seeing her neighbors forced onto trains, never to be seen again. Of course, we weren't really taught this at school. We were taught that the Germans had suppressed the Poles and how our Russian brothers had saved us. Jews weren't Polish, of course. Some Poles still blamed them for the war. That year, Mother said, there had been unrest, student strikes all across the country, so the party had turned on the Jews. They had called them traitors, dismissed them from their jobs. This was why Baniak's family had left. Once they were gone, no one ever spoke about them. One day, your country is yours, and the next, it isn't. Baniak's departure spelled the end of my childhood, and of the childhood of my mind. It was as if everything I'd assumed before had turned out to be false. As if behind every unconscious thing in the world lay something much darker and uglier. Every morning and evening now, Granny and Mother would let me into the little room. We'd huddle together by the speaker, silent and serious, leaning forward, listening to the voices from across the wall, and after the program was over, Granny and Mother would explain something new about our history. How for over a century, the country had been divided by Russia and Germany. How it had ceased to exist on the maps. How the culture had survived in the underground, parents teaching children their forbidden language and history, and how the country had finally gained independence after the First Great War. They taught me about the second one too, the side where we never were told. How, after years of occupation, the people of Warsaw rose up against the Nazis, how the Soviets arrived, and how instead of helping the uprising, they stayed on the other side of the Wisla and waited. They knew that win the war, knew the Germans would retreat eventually, so they let them take revenge on the Poles. The Soviets watched on as the city was decimated and its population slaughtered or deported. Then the Germans finally left. There were fewer than 1,000 survivors in the capital. I guess you believed what they told us in school, that the Soviets were our liberators, that they were the good ones, our allies. Sometimes I wish I could have been as light as you, because I didn't enjoy these nights in my mother's room. these terrible truth spills. They were a ritual, their pull too strong to resist. Even if I didn't understand it all, I understood enough for anger to collect at the bottom of my stomach. The fact that I couldn't tell anyone made it all worse. I'd been handed a poisoned gift, powerful truth I could never admit to knowing. Mother had made me swear never to mention anything to anyone, lest they suck her, or worse. I suppose the scariest thing was the lack of certainty. The 50s were over, and people no longer disappeared for speaking out. But in the 60s, and even later, things were more arbitrary. Almost anything was possible, depending on who happened to denounce you and what they thought you could get from you. Even with my childish intuition, I sensed that the single mother was more vulnerable than most. So, just like before, I'd take part in the morning salutes at school and bow in front of the portrait that hung above the teacher's desk of party chairman Gomuka's ancient, crumpled face scowling down at us. I took part in the marches, in the parades, in the first May celebrations, the anniversaries of the October Revolution, holding banners with obsequious slogans, praising our Soviet brothers, singing the songs they had taught us. I was like the little boy in Hans Christian Andersen's tale, The Emperor's New Clothes. Except I didn't speak up. I pretended not to see the obvious truth. That we had never asked for this system. That it had been forced upon us. I sat through the lessons and endured it all, carrying Beniak's banishment inside me, bile collecting in the pit of me. During breaks, I'd pick fights with other boys, coming away with a bloody nose or busted lips and temporary relief. And I swore that I would never become one of them, one of those who led their mendacious lives in submission to the system. One day, as you came out of the lake, you asked me whether I had a girlfriend. I shook my head, thrown by your question. You were bent over, drying your thighs, and I couldn't see your face. I smiled to hide my embarrassment, even though you couldn't see me. No, I finally said. And you? You'd reached your feet. I watched you run a corner and your flimsy towel through the crevices between your toes. And you looked up, confident that I was waiting for you. No, you said carefully. Not really. What do you mean? You straightened, brushing your hair back with your hand. You looked both defiant and amused. It means I used to, but not anymore. I prefer this now. And before I could ask anything further, before I could gauge your words and the corridors lying beyond them, you came over and pulled me in. Your mouth sat down on my neck, avidly, like a vampire, I thought, and closed my eyes. On the last morning at the lake, we packed our things and dismantled the tent. We watched it collapse onto the ground like a dying hot air balloon. Then we flattened and folded its lifeless body and pushed it into the cylindrical bag. We did it all without exchanging a word. You know, we can't tell anyone, you said to me, suddenly serious, pulling the bag closed. About what? I asked. I knew exactly. My stomach was like a towel being twisted. I watched you collect the rods laying scattered on the ground, opening the bag again and shoving them inside. You threw me a furtive look. About this. I picked up a stick and threw it towards the lake, seeing it fly and fall in vain, not making a sound. No, I guess we can't. We hadn't really talked about us, or what it would be like back in the city, or anything else. There was no us. Of course, I had thought about it, had wanted to ask, what is this? What are we going to do with it when we get back? But I never asked this in the glare of daylight. I wouldn't have dared. Maybe I'm confused, the moments merging into one another, disfiguring each other like too many voices speaking at once. But now that I think of it, I remember I only dared ask on the last night, as we lay in the dark of the tent, about to fall asleep after having made love. I asked the question into the dark, afraid. You didn't say anything for an interminable moment, and I thought you had fallen asleep. Finally, you whispered, I don't want this to end. My heart beating hard, knocking against the wall of my chest, I replied, me neither. When we arrived to the city, light came from every corner, bounced off every facade, and hotly and radiantly, as I felt flooded with happiness and anxiety. I was no longer in control. I think back to the lake, the tent compulsively, like the birth of something I could not yet imagine. I had found my place on your sandstone body, between your thighs, on the mounds of your nipples, in the cave of your armpits. The geography of you was suddenly as clear as that of the city, skin warmed like the bricks of the tenement houses. The lines of your body like the straight and unbroken lines of the avenues, of the tram tracks, and the stiff metal barriers that threw criss-cross shadows onto the streets. The same barriers that appeared stable but could move under your weight, creaking when you leant on them for too long, threatening to release you onto the busy, car-ridden tar. When I arrived in the flat, it seemed smaller to me than before. The kitchen was to the right as soon as you entered. It was long and narrow and only big enough to hold my landlady, Pani Koleska. This was her territory. No matter how scarce the supplies, no matter how harsh the rationing, she was always in there, baking. Somehow, there would always be sugar and flour and something she'd scrape up or exchange. There'd be Charlotka apple tarts and Bibetka crepes, cakes with cream, or layered gingerbread with plum jam. She baked like her life depended on it, and maybe it did. I had loved her ever since I moved in, fresh from Warsaw, referred from the center for student accommodation. I loved her warm voice and soft presence, and her small childlike face. She seemed so old it's almost made her ageless, like a being from another world. Usually, she'd sleep on the brown couch in the living room, next to the table where we ate, and the cabinet with the collection of rocks her husband had left behind. But in the summer, the block heated up like a glass house, and sometimes, when I got up at night to go to the bathroom, I'd see her sleeping there on the tiled floor of the kitchen with the door open, large and peaceful, like some creature swept up by the sea. The door to my room was next to the rock cabinet. It held a foldable bed and a small desk, one pushed aside to open the door to the balcony. We were on the 7th floor, and you could see where the tops of the other blocks, like the heads of people standing in front of you in a crowd. You and I lived on opposite sides of the city, me to the west, you to the east, and separated by the Wisla. A tramp connected us, passing through the old town and across the river. To the south, always visible, the gigantic palace of culture towered over the rest of the city. I lived where the ghetto had been, where the Nazis had razed everything to the ground to leave no trace of their crimes. Wola was the name of the neighborhood. Will or determination in English. The party had rebuilt it as part of their socialist dream. A network of identical blocks stood lined up nearly like cardboard boxes, as far as the eye could see. We called this the blokowisko. There were new parks, new trees, and new children, playing obviously in between the blocks, on layers of invisible footprints and the dust of forbidden lives. You lived in Praga, one of the few neighborhoods that had made it almost unscathed through the war. There where the Russians had waited and watched the destructions of the city by the Germans, where they had looked on without firing a bullet as the Germans destroyed Wola, as they quietly and clear-headedly decimated the old town, the museums, the libraries, the archives, allowing a whole world to burn into oblivion. I walked home slowly. The air was suffocating. The sky was gray and sticky. Wind blew through the streets, swirling up dust. The few people around looked hurried, caught inside their own minds, even more than usual, their faces like masks. I was relieved to get home. Nicolescu wasn't there. I sat and took out the papers the professor had given me. My head was empty, but I started anyway. Placed pen to paper, I forced myself to think. I didn't really want this, but neither did I want to let it slip away. I had nothing else, no other path. And there was a certain pleasure in doing what I had not allowed myself before. A satisfaction in the forbidden, a challenge. I knew I was really wanted to write about. The book that had moved me more than anything, more than any book before. But I also knew I couldn't write about Giovanni's room. It had never been published in Poland. I wasn't even supposed to know about it. But I had read Baldwin's other stories. They dealt mostly with the Negro in American society, of his discrimination and shutting. I could see its relevance, see how it exposed the double standards of the West, how it showed racism and white supremacy behind the liberalism and democracy extolled by the capitalist powers. At the same time, of course, I could identify. I carried my difference, my shame, on the inside. It wasn't visible. Not to everyone straight away, at least, but it was there, and it was a danger. That's what I began to write about. I remembered what I'd read about Malcolm X, about his friendship with Baldwin, and his struggle. His radical views on oppression and self-defense. I wrote furiously, my body dissolving, my head spinning, losing all sense of time. The keys turned in the lock, and Pani Koleska stood in the door. I was struck by how short she was, how dwarfed by the size of her shopping net, which I took from her and placed on the kitchen counter. "Thank you, dear," she said, removing her beret. "The queues are getting longer, or my legs are getting weaker, but I managed to get meat." She smiled, her small smile that came through her eyes. "It's a miracle." A moment later, potatoes were boiling, and I sat at the table, grating carrots. "Let's be happy," she said, taking the meat out of its stained gray paper and placing it on the counter. "If things continue this way, any cutlet might be our last." She started beating it with prickly mullet, the banging almost drowning out her words. "You heard the news?" She handed me a dry white roll, a plate, and started to crack open eggs on the edge of a bowl. I shook my head. Gierek decided to increase the meat prices. "What?" I looked at her in disbelief. She turned to me, wiping her hands on the apron. "Meat products are up by 60% in the canteens." "They can't just do that," I said, disbelief minging with anger. She turned back to the meat, beating it again with her mullet. "That's what we thought before, but they can, and they will." Later we ate without speaking, savoring every mouthful, the cutlet with its crispy breading, and the grated carrots with cream, and the buttery potatoes sprinkled with drill. Usually, Pani Koleska would tell me stories of her life and her marriage, their travels, how she had accompanied her husband on his exhibitions. But not that night. That night something hung over us. One by one, in the night outside, the lights went on in the blokowisko. Your house, like all the others in Praga, was tired and beaten down. Bullet holes shaped like stars covered the facade, and rusty balconies faced the street, some with clothes hanging to dry. Beyond the arch entrance was the country yard, where, surrounded by high grasses and yellow gladiolas, stood a Madonna. Her face was pale, and she wore a blue gown, palms turned up to the sky, a halo of gold-painted stars around her delicate head. In those days, I was as far away from the church as I would ever be. But there was something about the beauty of the statue, in the midst of the country yard's decay, that moved me, stayed with me as I walked up to your flat. The stairs looked so old and fragile, I wasn't sure they would carry me. They smelled of dampness and groaned with each step, but they held. On the first floor, old woman looked at me suspiciously, ignored my greeting. On the third floor, a band of children ran across the landing, screaming and cursing like drunkards. Your place was on the fourth and last floor. Lucio, you whispered when you opened the door, throwing a searching glance at the landing behind me. Your room was small, but you lived by yourself. That in itself was a luxury. Old wooden floors, 2 windows facing the country yard, a desk, and iron-framed bed in the corner where we lay down. We kissed for a long time, hard, trying to still a bottomless thirst. You asked whether I was hungry, and fished out a loaf from behind the curtains, pulling them shut. You cut the bread, holding it against your chest like a baby, and moving the serrated knife towards your heart. We sat there for a while, chewing with satisfaction on the fat slices, hearing the creaking sounds of the house and the muffled voices of the neighbors. I told you how I'd shown my idea to Professor Milevich that day, and how excited he'd been. The proposal would be ready for submission that week. "That's great," you said between bites, your eyes glistening. "I hope you get it." "Me too," I said. "And if not, I don't know what I'll do then." You turned to me, seemingly encouraged. "I could try and get you work in my department once I'm settled." I shook my head. "No." You looked at me, as if expecting an explanation. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "But you hear about the food prices?" I finally asked. You nodded and looked away. "And?" I probed. Now the silence was yours. "And what?" you shrugged. "If they do it, it needs to be done." "Are you serious? They are doing it because they don't know how to run the country. Where do you think all of our food is going? All the food we produce. It's paying debts. It's going to Russia and to the West. And we have nothing left." You were quiet for a moment, your face frozen. You need to watch who you say this to. You know that, Lucio, don't you? I held your stare. "But you know it's true," I said, determined. You got up, retrieved a half-empty bottle of Mazovzanka from under the desk, and poured it into a glass. "Yes," you said this quietly, with your back to me. "But there's no good in knowing that. Not at all." You returned to the bed, handed me the water. "For your own sake, don't be so hot-headed, or you'll get yourself in a lot of unnecessary trouble. So why don't let's drop it," you said abruptly, your tone striking me with its sudden coldness. "We haven't had the same lives. We don't agree on this." My head was reeling, the glass cold in my hand. You had never spoken to me like this, with such detachment. I didn't know whether I wanted to run away or be appeased. Either way, I no longer felt like talking. A new silence took hold and began to scatter your last words to their vehemence. You lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and I lay down beside you. Then your hands found their way to me, your eyes meeting mine consolingly. blinking an apology. Our bodies moved towards each other by instinct. I felt your chest underneath your skirt, retraced the swing of your collarbones, the hardness of your shoulders. You tasted the same, warm and earthy. I pulled off your clothes in the dim light. Your tan was still visible, and around us the house was alive. Feet scuffled below. Water pipes gurgled. Taps were turned on and off, accompanying our struggles. Later, when the night had fallen and we had exhausted ourselves, we lay facing each other, the tip of your nose on the bridge of mine. Nothing else mattered in the dark. I'm starting my job tomorrow, you said after a while. I'll come and pick you up if you like. You shook your head. Better not. Better not give them any reason to suspect. I will meet you at the pool on Wednesday. I said nothing, letting your words echo in my mind, weighing them individually. So we've suddenly become a secret, huh? You lifted yourself onto your elbows, your eyes looking darker. We've always been a secret, Ludwig. It's just that until now, there was no one to hide from. You smiled for an instant, maybe out of discomfort. Do you know what they would do if they found out? Your brows furrowed. They have lists. They keep track. And they know how to use information. You let your index finger pass across my cheek, gently. It felt like a threat. I flickered my head. Your hand moved away. There's no law against what we're doing. I know that. Your voice softened. But we need to act as if there were. Do you know what they did to Foucault? I looked at you blankly. The philosopher? You nodded. What's he got to do with this? You sat up on the bed, your back against the wall. He came to Warsaw when he was young to head some French cultural institute, and Secret Service knew about him. So they found a handsome student and introduced him into Foucault's circle and made sure the guy charmed him. It worked. One day, the two of them took a room at a Bristol and boom, you snapped your fingers. In come the agents, catching them in bed. They charged Foucault with soliciting prostitution. A week later, he'd resigned and was back in Paris. Your voice sounded almost triumphant, as if impressed by their efficiency. But for an instant, I saw a velvet of anxiety ripple across your face. You see? I said nothing. The water pipes churned with a low thud, and I felt a heaviness settle over me. And you want to live like that, Janusz? In fear? You laughed, your confidence in place again. I'm not afraid. We just need to mind our own business. Avoid risks, be smart. As long as we do that, we'll be fine, don't you think? I shrugged, feeling defeated. Good. He jumped up from the bed, newly energized. I'm going to take a shower, slipping on a shirt and shorts. You disappeared into the corridor. That week you started a job and I worked on my proposal, submitting it to the board after some help from the professor. Then all I could do was wait. And because the flat was small and my nervous energy overwhelming, I spent my days walking through the city, One morning, I walked through Wola, past the blokowisko, towards the cemeteries. The largest was the Polski. It had pruned elm trees and endless rows of graves with crosses, all cared for and dusted and attended, like sculptures in the museum. Next to it was a small Muslim cemetery for the Tatars that no one ever seemed to visit. It was the size of a classroom, with the graves beginning to disappear in the grass, like an archaeological site in the making. And then there was a Jewish cemetery. It was large and deep, a rectangle with no visible end. No one could look inside. It was abandoned, gates locked forever. The only thing I could see was the army of giant poplars soaring above the wall that protected the city from this shard of history. I walked along the wall, its old red bricks covered in vines, and admired the sturdy trees swaying in the wind. I imagined nature taking its course, unhindered, on the other side. The little forests growing from the hearts of forsaken graves. From where I stood, they looked like the most beautiful trees in the city. I walked on, passing the abandoned factories, where flocks of crows lingered and caved with their chalky sword-like beaks, throwing large shadows across the dusty plots. Crossing Wola and going towards the center of the city, I reached the square with the monument to the ghetto uprising. I shivered as I took in its size. The plane of their distorted faces caved into the facade. I quickened my pace along the large wide avenues. You could only cross every 500 meters, and it made you feel both exposed and removed. I walked and walked across the Felix Dziewski Square, all the way to the center. Then a little south towards the Palace of Culture and its gigantic square that pierced the late summer sky. Standing beneath it, Stalin's gift to the city, its concrete knot, its biggest scar. I looked up and my head began to spin. It was September, still warm, yet somehow the air already contained a hint of decay. I walked home. The city had filled up again after the emptiness of summer. Students had returned for another year. Workers had come back from their holidays. The queues for the shops swelled like bloody lips. Deliveries had become so few and far between that the only way to get anything was to wait. The lines had started to occupy whole streets. I had to push through the queue for the grocery store, where women stood with empty baskets, trying to look over the heads of those in front to see what was happening. Sometimes I'd stand and talk, but mostly people kept to themselves, mumbling complaints, telling off those suspected of pushing in. Pani Koleska would go out every morning, early, and join queues that seemed mostly promising, according to the rumor picked up by some acquaintance. She would walk to the city, carrying shopping nets in her handbag at all times, and whenever she chanced to walk past a queue that seemed like it might yield something, whether it was toilet paper or canned beans, she'd join and wait. Most evenings, Pani Koleska came home empty-handed, tired. She'd sit at the table in the living room, her hands illuminated by a tiny lamp, using leftover cloth to make hats she'd sell in the queues. She'd smile at me when I got back from the palace. from your place. Night having fallen outside. Waiting for nothing. Queuing for a possibility. That's what we're all doing now, she said, quietly one night. Her eyes sparkled with sadness and irony. There is no other currency than time, and it's cheap. We were eating less and fewer things. I often ate at the campus canteen, though there was no meat. But sometimes we'd be lucky. Sometimes I'd come home and she'd be standing in the kitchen, the radio beside her playing Chopin, something fragrant cooking on the stove, most likely with cumin. She loved cumin. "Come and eat, Lucio," she'd say, with a smile in her small eyes. "You must be hungry. Sit down and tell me about your day." One morning, while I was still waiting to hear from Professor Milevich, I found Pani Koleska lying on her bed in the living room, blanket pulled up to her chin. "It's the standing," she said, coughing. Her cough was dry and violent, like a complaint. It seemed strange that a small, fragile being could make such a sound. I prepared some tea for her, dissolved honey in it that she'd bought from the countryside where her sisters lived. But it didn't help. The coughing continued. "I'm sorry," she said, her eyes red with exhaustion. "I will need to get some medicine." That night, the winds grew stronger. The trees in the country yard moved against each other, air howling between their branches. I woke up and heard the coughing from the next room, sharp and uncontrolled, like a threat. The next morning, I went to a pharmacy for Pani Koleska. They didn't have what I needed. "We might get it in 2 weeks," the pharmacist said, without a trace of emotion on his face. I tried another pharmacy further away, and they told me the same. I walked back to the flat with anger collected at the bottom of my stomach, pulsing through my body. "Don't worry," said Pani Koleska. "It's fine. I just need some rest." I made her some more tea and boiled some vegetables. I poured her food from the canteen, rusky pierogi and pickled cabbage. But the cough continued. Its dry cracking sound would stir me from sleep, accompany my nights, as if something was trying to tear up her body from inside. During those weeks, you and I would go to the university pool every now and then. It wasn't far from the old town, tucked in below the ramparts of the faculty grounds. I remember its large reception hall and the strong smell of chlorine. How I liked the smell. And the cloakroom where we left our shoes in a shaped clothes bag. In the changing rooms, we undressed amongst other boys, drying ourselves, joking around, unaware of their nudity. Or used to it, like something that was given. Strong backs and thighs and asses, skins smooth and covered in drops like forest leaves after rain. But in a strange way, this didn't excite me. When we were naked like that, changing, showering amongst them, we weren't really ourselves. We were lighter, without consequence. We took off our alls along with the clothes and only belonged to the anonymous world of bodies. And when we swam around and I pushed through the water, I felt even lighter. It reminded me of our summer together, of the ease with which we'd floated across the lake. As I swam, I dissolved in the water, and something came to me from the depths of my memory. I was very young. Father had just left us, and Mother was so distraught. I was afraid she'd die from grief. She stayed in her room all day, her lips pale, her eyes red. I tried to cheer her up, to distract her from my picture books that I'd bring to her bed and read out loud. Then one day she came out of her room, her face made up, lipstick on, and eyes dark with kohl. And she took me outside and lifted me onto her bike. We rode along our street and across the large empty park in the pool in the domed Centennial Hall. This is where she taught me. This is where we went into the water together, and she, my lifeline, held me while I wriggled my legs and arms, exhilarated and free. She taught me patiently to trust my body, to let myself float, to move on my own. For years we'd go together, even when I no longer needed her to hold me. I wanted her to see me, to be proud of me, to make each of us feel important to the other. So when the day came, some years later, when they found something in her lungs, and I came home from school to find a flat empty, with only Granny crying on the couch, it never occurred to me to go back to the pool. Not without her. It was as if a part of my life had died along with her, as if it could never return. One night, after one of our swims in the pool, it was beginning to get dark outside. Coming out with our hair still wet, we could see the Wisla shimmering, the trees moving slowly in the wind. The air smelled fresh and moist. Summer still lingered, but already one could sense the cooler winds sweeping across the endless plains of Siberia, announcing the end of worms. It was autumn's gateway that night. We wandered down the slope of a little park and on to Dover Street. It was the first time I'd seen you after you'd started work. And you told me that your boss liked you, that he'd already given you texts to read, books awaiting permission to be published. It was your job to examine them, to find criticism of the party or anything unsuitable for the public. You seemed electrified, your eyes wide, your words sounding like they were meant for an audience. I let you go on, unsure what to do with my anger, until you stopped your speech and looked at me. "Have you nothing to say?" you asked, and as if expecting praise. I let silence rush in, hoping it would blur the reality of this moment. Our footsteps resonated in the dimly lit street. There was no one there except us. I held on to the stillness for as long as it would let me, for as long as I could. "You should know by now that you will never impress me with your work," I heard myself say, "that it will never bring us closer." You looked like you were about to say something. "Meanwhile," I went on, unable to contain the bitterness, "the queues are becoming infinite. There is less and less to eat. And Fanny Koleska is ill. She's coughing like a death-bound dog. They don't even have the medicine for her." Your face lost its tension. It was your turn to be silent. "I'm sorry," you finally said, sounding reduced, speaking only to me again. I'm sorry to be living under this bloody system." Your brows furrowed and you glanced behind us. "Don't say things like that." There was a hint of fear in your voice. It gave me a strange satisfaction. "What else are we going to do?" Let them do anything they please? You stopped, looking behind us, grabbing me by the shoulders. Work. Keep quiet. You looked straight into me. Don't do anything stupid. I avoided your eyes. I meant it, Lucio. You shook me, as if trying to wake me up. I told you, we mustn't take risks. You want to protest? What for? To end up in prison and to be martyred for nothing? I raised my eyes and looked at you, suddenly aware of us standing like this is a street, our faces so close. There are ways to live a good life, you went on, as if hearing my thoughts. I'll figure things out. Can't you trust me? Your eyes pleaded in a way I had never seen before. We heard a sound of boots clicking on the pavement. Janusz! A cry came from the other side of the street. A girl was standing in the round spot of light, streaming down from the steep lamp. Is that you? You released me. Hania! Your face lit up. She crossed the street and we fell into each other's arms. I saw her face on your shoulder, smiling for a moment with her eyes closed. My mind reeled. She opened her eyes and looked at me. It was like seeing a ghost. The pale white skin, the intense dark eyes. I'd never seen her up close, but still recognized her. It was a girl I'd seen you at the camp with. She looked very stylish, in a trench coat and cowboy boots, but even more remarkable were her earrings. They were beaded and shone in all colors of the rainbow, like the tail of an exotic bird, and so long they almost touched her shoulders. I couldn't take my eyes off them. Janusz, I haven't seen you in ages, she cried, adjusting her hair, making the earrings move along with her. Where have you been all these weeks? Her eyes fell on me. There was a pause in which she and I looked at each other, slightly embarrassed, until you said, Here, let me introduce my swimming colleague. Hania, this is Ludwig. She shook hands with me. Hers was soft and white, like a dove. It's a pleasure to meet you, she said, sounding like she meant it, looking into my eyes for a moment before turning back to you. She put her hand on my arm. She put her hand on your arm. I'm going to see Rafa. Now. He lives just around the corner. Do you want to come? You glanced from her to me. She was entirely turned to you. I would like to, but... You're busy? She raised her eyebrows. Come on, just for one drink. We've been saying how much we've missed you. I could see your fingers closing tight around the strap on your back. You wore an expression I found impossible to read. I can't tonight. You finally said, I'm sorry. Next time. She looked at you for a while until a smile curled itself around her lips. Fine, but no excuses for my birthday party. At the end of the month. You're coming? Yes? You nodded. She kissed you goodbye and ran off, her boots beating on the concrete. We stood for a moment without speaking. The air strangely charged. You looked gloomy. Worried even. Everything okay? I asked. You nodded without looking at me. All good. Let's go. Do you think she saw us? I don't know. I don't think so. Again, your face was inscrutable. We climbed a set of narrow stairs, lined by a large stone wall. Behind it lay the nuns' convent, their cloister with the ore cars and grazing cows, and new residential blocks towering just above. A group of boys in tight jeans came towards us, walking down the narrow passageway. One held a small, heavy made-up girl around the waist, while another, with a sharp face and gelled-back hair, looked you up and down with curious eyes. You noticed him, and your face seemed to harden. You looked away. We reached the top of the bridge, and we waited for the traffic lights. To our right lay the city, the neon lights of the tall buildings glistening, advertising clubs and restaurants. To our left was the Wisla and the dark shore of Praga. I thought I could sense your restlessness. You looked at me from the side. "What is it?" I said. You looked ahead at the red light. "I think it's better if I spend tonight by myself." You sounded careful, circumscribed. "Just tonight." "Why?" "I need time to be alone." I looked into your eyes, trying to discern what this meant. Your look was steady. "I'm just tired," you said. "I need a rest, all right? I'll see you soon." "Is it because of Hania?" You shook your head, not looking at me. "Don't overthink it." The light turned green and the tram appeared. We said goodnight, our hands in our pockets, and then you crossed over without looking back. 3 days passed, and no message came. Rather than drive myself crazy, I caught a rattling tram to the other side of the river. You opened the door shirtless, holding a razor in your hand. You seemed surprised to see me, but not displeased. You invited me in. There was a water bottle on your desk and a little mirror propped against a pile of books. "I'm just getting ready to go out," you said, sitting down and running a hand over your stubble. "And drink. My boss invited us to his place." You tried to sound casual and threw me a glance as if to test my reaction. I was calm. You took up the razor and looked at yourself again. "Can we see each other tomorrow? At the pool?" I nodded, relieved to have some certainty. "Sure. Have fun tonight." I managed to say this without sounding sarcastic. You stood and kissed me hard on the mouth, razor still in hand. I went to a student cafe near campus and prepared for my interview with the board that would take place if I passed into the next round. I'd come to like my topic on Baldwin's analysis of racism in America. Professor Milevich had praised it too, saying it'd be the first in the country to examine it. It made me think that throughout my life, up to this point, everything I'd done had felt either irrelevant or replaceable. Here, for the first time, was something wholly mine, something that needed me in order to exist. I was expecting news from the professor any day now. I tried to remain hopeful. When the cafe closed, I took my things and made my way home. It was a balmy night, maybe the last one of the year, and so I decided to walk, taking a long route. I walked towards the old town, where the lights had been switched off for the night. Couples sat kissing at the foot of King Sigmund's column, or leaning against the walls of the constructed castle. I walked through the little narrow streets, past the cathedral, and out on the old market square, which was almost empty except for the tourists taking photos of the restored Baroque facades. The sky was a square, drawn by the high roofs of those houses, and then I heard the faint but steady sound of a saxophone, with a bass chasing after it. The melody drifted through the air, little more than a whisper of jazz. I walked towards the sound, and on the other side of the square, the music seemed to come from the darkened building, with all its curtains drawn. One ground-level window was illuminated. I crouched and looked down into the vaulted cave filled with a buzzing crowd, smoke gliding from their faces towards the ceiling, glasses held to their lips. A band was playing. Just below the window, I recognized the composition as one by Cometa, maybe from the soundtrack of Knife in the Water. Tempting, chaotic, then languid. My mind listened to the story of the notes as my eyes wandered the crowd until they landed on you. It was as if someone had turned off the music, like an electric shock in my mind. You and your perfectly shaven face turned towards her, her earlobe between your fingers, her earrings reflecting the light in all the colors of the spectrum. A rush went through my belly like a snake. You moved together to the music, you holding her and her holding you. Her hands were on your shoulder, her painted fingernails flashing in the light, her long skirt shifting with the music. This is an image I cannot forget. Your hands around her waist, your fingers sinking into the fabric of her skirt. They looked settled there, and I was struck by the tenderness in your eyes. I watched you both as if you were a pair of strangers. I tried to tell myself that I didn't mean anything, that it wasn't real, and yet I could no longer look at you without feeling absolutely drained of any power. I got to my feet, feeling lightheaded, my vision blurred for a moment. I walked home, my heart beating twice for every step I took. I guess you never knew that I saw you that night. Do you remember the music? Do you remember her earrings? Are there things you've forgotten, or things I've missed out? My memory has its limits, of course. It may color in the blanks without admitting to it, dramatize or revise. I guess there is no photographic memory for emotions. But this is my truth right now, for better or worse. I left work early today. The flat was a mess, so I tidied up. Here it is, beginning to grow cold. But it's still mild for the season. In the mornings, it's best to wear a coat, but the midday sun is strong, and on the avenues of Midtown, businessmen take off their suit jackets during lunchtime, their white shirts glistening in the winter light, their gym-trained asses pushing against the fabric of their trousers as they move purposely down the street. Now, not like at home, where by now people must be wrapped in scarves and hats. I bet the air is already sharp, stings your face. I remember that cold, the merciless, crisp cold of Warsaw in December. And for a moment, it feels like I am there among the smell of diesel and burning coal, the long board avenues with the palace of culture looming over us, you beside me. Of course, I still see them here, the Poles, in the streets of Greenpoint, buying their poppy seed cakes and pierogi and twarog cheese. I spot them a mile off, so easily, like recognizing like. But the ones that come here are different. They have hope in their eyes, just as I did when I arrived. They are awake. I switched on the TV at 10 o'clock. A speech by Reagan. Images of some space shuttle, Muhammad Ali falling to the ground in the ring. Then the image behind the presenter changed to a white and red flag, and my insides turned weightless. Martial law continues in Poland, said the lady with her bleached teeth and wide-shouldered blazer. Despite the expulsion of foreign journalists, we have evidence that the Polish army has stationed tanks and thousands of troops in the 5 largest cities across the country in response to a wave of protests. Experts say this move shows the government desire to solve the crisis without the help of Kremlin, in an attempt to avoid an escalation of violence. Despite this, the Soviets' military bases in Poland remain on call. A photo filled the screen for a moment, showing a tank parked on a snowy square. A couple of soldiers climbing out its hatch. Right behind them, a building I recognized with a pang of nostalgia. The Moskva, a cinema where Carolina and I used to go sometimes. But most remarkable, the poster that hung above the tank. Apocalypse Now, in bloody red type, the new film by Coppola. For a moment, the absurdity of it filled my throat, threatened to suffocate me. All these years, they'd let us watch foreign films, allowing us glimpses of the world across the wall, of freedoms we didn't have. Did they really think we'd be still forever? I thought of the photographer and his courage, imagining how the photo had made it out of the country. A roll of film smuggled into West Germany, in a secret compartment, or an empty tube of toothpaste. Anonymous figures trapped on the wrong side of history, compressed and rolled up inside a stranger's pocket. No matter what happens in the world, however brutal or dystopian a thing, not all it is lost, if there are people out there risking themselves to document it. Little sparks cause fire too. The morning after I saw you with Hanya, I awoke feeling hungover. I remembered the night before and my body burned, like a muscle sore all over. I lay in my bed, the sky grey and thin beyond the roofs of the blocks. My thoughts were like swallows, nose-diving, avoiding the ground, flying up and away. I didn't know how to stop them. I got up to go to the bathroom, but found Pani Koleska in the living room sleeping. Something caught my eye, something small and dark. I approached her without making a sound. Blots covered with white duvet near her mouth. The same blots on the handkerchief, like she was holding in her hand, dark and irreversibly crimson. I had to stop myself from gasping out loud. She was breathing quietly, her white hair untied, spread out on her pillow like a halo. She looked like an ancient child. Fear rang, vibrated, like a church bell inside me. I pulled on my shoes and coat and hurried out into the cool morning. The nearest doctor's office was at the junction of Freedom and Lenin. I reached it, out of breath, just as they were opening. Already there was a group of people waiting by the door. A burly woman sat at the desk, looking at her schedule through thick glasses in which her eyes seemed tiny and miles away. Then it was finally my turn. I took her about Pani Koleska, my words stumbling over each other. The coughing, the blood. One doctor is busy, she said, without looking up at me. Earliest appointment is next week. I insisted it was an emergency. She looked up at me for a moment, her phlegmatic face almost compassionate. In that case, try the hospital, but I doubt she'll get in ahead of people with cut-off limbs and bleeding faces. Then she bent over her papers again. There must be something else you can do. I felt the moment slipping through my fingers. People, please, can't you make an exception? She raised her eyes towards me again, this time without a trace of empathy. I told you what to do. Now stop blocking the line for your fellow citizens. I stood in the cold morning on the large Freedom Avenue, the sun far away, not warming, only blinding, throwing its wide light across the pavement onto the throngs of people hurrying to work with downcast faces. One day, not long after Beniak's departure, I come home from school and found Granny crying on the couch. She was sobbing so hard she couldn't even tell me what was wrong, until she finally calmed down, saying that they found something in Mother's lungs. It's not serious, she'd said, her tears beginning to dry on her cheeks. The doctors will take care of it. I stood in the cold morning and thought of how we'd sat in hospital waiting for them to release Mother. How the clock in the waiting room had kept on ticking. How I'd held on to Granny's hand like a life vest. Smoke round us, oozing from the cigarettes held by nervous hands. The air grey and heavy. Impenetrable. And finally, the doctor, tall and dry, with a rigid face, saying he had bad news. I walked to the nearest hospital, as the lady had said. It was an anonymous block I'd ridden past countless times without even seeing it. By the entrance, a man with crutches and a single leg, wearing a ragged dressing gown, was smoking a cigarette. Inside, grey corridors filled with a sharp smell of disinfectant. I pulled a number by the reception desk and took a seat in a queue on one of the benches. Groups of people were waiting in miserable silence, pierced only by the wails of patients lying on makeshift beds in the corridor. Hospital time took over, solid and unfeeling, like a glacier. A man across from me was reading the People's Tribune. From the front of the party chairman, Gierek glared at me. He was shaking hands with someone off-frame, his face moosey and thin-lipped, and so utterly smug. My hands turned into fists inside my coat. Number 33. It was my turn. Behind the glass, in her little cubicle, the nurse kept her eyes on the papers in front of her. I explained everything again, this time in more detail, trying to sound humble, to make it seem as serious as it felt. Is the patient here? She interrupted, looking up for the first time. She's at home. I need to speak to a doctor about the symptoms." Her expression was lifeless, bored. "This is a hospital. Come back with the patient, or take her to the doctor's office. Number 34. Her eyes discarded me. "Please, I already went there. They have no appointments this week. Can't I just see a doctor for a moment?" "I don't make up the rules around here." "Number 34. I was about to protest again when someone shoved me away from the counter. Heat sprang up in me. "Move," huffed the middle-aged man who'd been queuing behind me, smelling of sweat and onions. "You're not the only one here with problems." I wanted to push him to the floor, to bang my fists against the lady's window, to scream my lungs out at them. I had a vision of myself doing just that, clear and vivid, as if they were actually happening. And this scared me. I left without saying a word, without looking at her or the man again. I walked out on the street, full of anger, feeling my legs tense. I walked as if in trance, hardly knowing where I was, until I felt a touch on my shoulder. And I saw that I was on a New World promenade, without knowing why. A stranger, a man in a suit and tie, was standing in front of me. Then I saw that it was you. You looking like a different person. Your hair combed to the side, your leather shoes gleaming. I despised you for the sympathy I saw in your face. "What are you doing here? What happened?" you asked as we stood in the middle of the street. "Panicolaska. Blood. No doctors." I felt tears rising in me, tears of anger, I think. You put your hand on my shoulder, heavy and warm. "Come on, Lucio. We'll go and have coffee somewhere. I'm on my lunch break. We'll figure something out." Your hand moved down to my back, guiding me along with you. I resisted its push. "Let go of me, Janusz," I said through gritted teeth. "I've had enough of figuring things out. Enough of the talk." You were undeterred. Your hand stayed where it was. "Lucio, you need to come down. Let's not make a scene in public. Let's go." I pushed your hand off, its weight freeing me. "Go back to your office," I said, the fury pouring out of me. "And to her, if you like." Your face changed. Understood, maybe. I turned quickly and left you standing there by yourself. At the empty telephone box, I dialed the only number I knew by heart. It rang several times, the beeping slow and plaintive. "Ludwig, my child." The tenderness in her raspy voice shook me to the core. There was loneliness in that voice too, an exhaustion, a voice no longer used to speaking. One that had used up most of its words. "Is everything all right, my love?" she asked. I could sense the stillness of our old flat while around the throngs of people rushed past. I nodded into the receiver. "Yes, Granny, I'm all right. I just wanted to hear you." I breathed in deeply. "It's so good to hear you. How are you?" "I'm well," she said gravely. "Don't worry about me. May God protect you, my love. Come home soon, yes?" Familiar guilt stirred in me, together with a longing for a faraway part of my childhood when everything had seemed almost carefree. "Yes, Granny, I will." I put down the phone and walked on, agitated by my powerlessness. I walked with a rage in my body, an old shame stirring, awakening in the depth of my stomach, heavy and hard and sharp. I walked in the direction of the flat, my eyes fixed on the pavement, on the cracks in the concrete. I came upon the large queue by a grocery store, and without knowing why, I stopped dead in my tracks. A rush went through the street, an undeniable shift of energy, as if it was about to thunder. Everyone, including the people in the queue, looked up. A cloud was falling from the sky, white and brilliant in the sunlight. Sheets of paper like wings, light and beautiful, like time, fluttering through the October air. It felt like a dream. Everyone stood still, women with their shopping nets, and couples and children stretching out their hands, looking up and around, letting the paper rain onto them. One of the sheets landed right by my feet. There was a red hand on it, seemingly dripping with blood and grabbing stalks of wheat. Our land, our food. Out with the Soviets, in with our rights. It said, in black letters, brothers and sisters, rise up tonight. The words resonated in me like a voice speaking in my head. The crowd's amazement turned into apprehension as soon as they read the words. A child bent down to pick up the sheets, and his mother ripped them out from his hands, slapped him, and tore him away. Some hurried along. Others looked up to the windows of the block that towered above us. I stood and watched, my senses in vertigo, my brain particularly calm. Already police sirens were howling, and the crowd ran towards the blocks. The queue dispersed, people hurrying off like guilty foxes. In the confusion of it all, I bent down and picked up the leaflets, stuffing handfuls into my bag. Wands of them. Hearing my pulse pound in my ears. With the sirens coming closer, I jumped to an approaching tram, with my heart threatening to leap out of my chest. Pani Kolaska was in the kitchen when I rushed in. She was leaning against the counter like a small brittle tree in a dressing gown, caught by to fit of coughing. I helped her back to bed, her weight on me. "How are you feeling?" I asked. She looked at me with her small watery eyes. "Maybe a little better, dear." I helped her lie down. There was a large water stain where the blood had been on her sheet. I pretended not to see it. In my room, I took out my radio and turned it on. To cover her coughing, to cover my thoughts. I wanted to drown out the voices in my head that said that even having these flyers was a folly, and cold could get me locked up. I didn't even hear the music. I sat on the edge of my bed with my head in my hands and my eyes closed. I remember the porcelain moving slowly against the merciless wind under the sky the color of concrete, starting from the church where Granny and I thanked everyone who'd come to pay their last respects. Consoling faces pressed against our frozen cheeks, relief that Father hadn't shown up, anger that Father hadn't shown up. The procession of regret and helplessness moved from the church along the streets of my childhood, the pavements of our games, past our flat and the park full of drunk hats. A coffin carried to the cemetery, lowered into a hole, earth hitting wood, handful after handful, marking the end of our previous lives. Only Granny and I remained, life having skipped a generation. The flat seemed empty. Gone were the nights by the radio. The news no longer mattered. We no longer cared about outside. We turned inwards. Granny started to attend church every day, getting up at 5 for the first Mass. She resigned herself entirely to God, handing herself over to heaven like a premature donation. And me, I withdrew into my books. The radio in Mother's room remained covered forever. No, not ever music came out of it again. Not for many years. I heard Penny Kaleska coughing, sharp and thorny. Then I turned to my radio, lowered the volume, and moved the indicator to 101.2. The frequency still ached in my mind after all these years. I lay in my bed, the speakers to my ear, holding my breath. At first it was only music, but already I was calmed. I felt like that music, just for its origin, was cleansing me. And then, not long after, the familiar voice, deep and comforting and clear. There had been several of them who'd read the news over the years. And this was one of them. He was still there. It brought me back to the first time we'd all sat together, the three of us, around the radio in Mother's room. A voice that couldn't be spoken over, that would be listened to until the very end. Radio Free Europe. News at 4 o'clock, Friday, the 10th of October, 1980. He talked about the strikes that had gripped the country, halting production in dozens of known locations, including factories, mines, and shipyards. Workers had laid down their tools, demanding the revocation of the increase in meat prices, as well as of better working conditions, the protection of the right to free speech, and the ability to form independent trade unions. There had been no violent clashes with the authorities so far. The strikes had yet not reached the capital, but insider sources indicated that they would, most likely that every afternoon. Residents are asked to remain indoors in case of any violent clashes with the authorities. I thought of Mother, of her pointless life, her passivity, of the years she'd spent listening to the radio, exclaiming her truth to me. And all of it for what? She died a submissive employee at the electricity office, and had never dared to speak up or live to any of her ideas. Your mother died of loneliness, Granny would always repeat, claiming it was because she had never remarried after my father. But I think it was despair that killed her. Having done only things she didn't believe in, she must have been dead inside for years before her body finally gave up too. I switched off the radio and got up, took my bag. I told Pani Kaleska I was going out for a walk. She nodded weakly and whispered, "Look after yourself." Outside, the air was pregnant with strife. The wind shook the trees, dry leaves rustled and dropped. I thought about where the demonstrations might be. The ones involving workers had always ended, violently or not, on a small square in front of the party headquarters by the National Museum. I jumped on a tram that went that way, and felt my heart so clearly, so distinctly that it might as well have been the engine pushing the tram along. The first people were returning from work, and the streets were full. Before the tram reached the crossing near the museum, it stopped abruptly, a sudden violent jerk. People screamed, trying not to lose their footing. I held on hard in order not to fall. A small girl and a man were thrown on the floor, falling with their arms spread out. The man's walking stick slid on the end of the carriage. I helped him up, feeling his bones, the rough tweed of his jacket, his body light like a skeleton. He thanked me breathlessly. As we looked up, we saw the tram driver's booth empty, the driver outside talking to a policeman. There was a barricade in the middle of the street, a sturdy metal fence blocking the passage. "Everyone out," the driver shouted as he came back. "Their journey ends here." The passengers looked at each other confused. "But why?" The little girl who'd fallen began to cry. "Don't ask so many questions," her mother said. "Let's go." We climbed out. On the other side of the barrier, the street was empty. A field of concrete without any cars, only masses of people, ushered along the pavements by police. Keep on walking, they shouted. "Hurry up, go home everyone now." The crowd moved slowly, in silent obedience, only whispers here and there. We saw the emptiness of the street before us, the square in front of the party building deserted, the building itself looming ominously above. I felt the flow of the crowd carry me away from the scene, and knew I had to find some way to stay there where the action would be. This is when I saw a lady leave a building nearby, the door still ajar behind her. I ran and caught the door before it shut. I slipped inside and closed it behind me. The staircase was silent. Doors led off it, with little signs indicating which offices they were. I walked up the stairs carefully, slowly, aware of every step. From the first floor, I could see the street and the crowds. I walked further up. On the second floor, one of the doors was half open. I saw the inside of an office, 2 figures in the window, looking down onto the street. "Don't go out now, Pani Valeska," said a man in a firm but friendly voice. "The demonstrations might come any minute. You'd better stay here until they pass." I slipped by them, quickly moving. Up on the 3rd and last floor. It was all quiet. I saw the abandoned empty tram, the crowds on the pavements, the policemen pushing them along the cattle. The rest of the street was a wide and empty expanse, all the way to the headquarters. Policemen in helmets lining the barriers. I crouched like a child in a treehouse, hands on the cold windowsill, my fingers pulsing, the sun beginning to set. And then something approached. A murmur could be heard from far away, like the sound of a beehive. And a horde appeared on the horizon. I couldn't see them well at first, but as they came closer, I saw they were workers. They wore heavy boots and dark overalls and marched with banners held above their heads. They were chanting too. As soon as they appeared in the middle of the square, a rush went through the street, and everything changed, like rain falling after hours of pregnant, hovering clouds. The crowds of the pavements seemed to stop to watch the marchers, and the police officers shouted louder, telling the people to move on. At the same time, a formation of policemen in helmets and masks marched in the direction of the strikers. A scream went through the bystanders. A policeman had hit someone with his stick. Without knowing why, I knew this was the moment. I got up. My heart was racing like a steam engine. I opened my bag, opened the window, felt the cool air against my face, the amplified buzz of the street in my ears. Then I turned my bag upside down above the street. The leaflets fluttered in the wind and glided up the way like a scattered flock of doves. It was like a cloud I had seen earlier that day, the cloud that had given birth to this cloud. And this one, too, managed to stop time. I saw the faces in the street looking up, men and women and children, the police as well, confusion and amazement drawn on them as the paper rained down like giant confetti. I thought I heard banging against the front door 3 stories down. My heart pounded like a fist. I looked around. There were 2 doors. I tried both of them. They were locked. I knocked urgently. Nothing happened. The banging on the front door became real and grew harder and louder. I ran down the flight. I tried one of the doors without success. A crash shook the building, the sound of breaking wood. They'd broken through. Gushes of adrenaline flooded me. I weighed nothing. My insides were made of fire. I rattled on the door handles, desperate. Got it. Police! Angry voices shouted from downstairs. Through I saw no one yet. Psst! I turned around. Behind the door had opened, and a man was looking at me intently, sizing me up. Then he gestured me in. Heavy footsteps on the stairs. Police! I jumped inside towards the man, and the door closed behind me. There was heavy tramping of police boots just outside the door. Shouting, running up to the top of the building, banging on the doors upstairs. I guess they hadn't seen me. The man who had opened the door had an intelligent, tired face and graying hair that made him look older than he probably was. We exchanged quick looks. There was also a woman, younger than him, not so far from my age, I guessed, tall and broad, with a kind face. We heard the policeman coming back down the stairs, banging on the doors of this floor, our door. The man and woman looked at each other, and he nodded in the direction of the corridor. Quick, Pani Valeska, the kitchen. The woman took me by an arm, and we hurried along the narrow corridor to a tiny kitchen with a view of the street. Before I could see anything going on outside, we heard more banging on the door, then the sound of it being opened. Citizen, we heard a voice boom in the other room. A suspect is hiding in this building. Have you seen him? A young man with light hair and a brown rucksack. There is no one here apart from myself and my secretary, said the man calmly. Then you will let us search the space. Their boots crossed the threshold. The woman and I looked at each other in the tiny kitchen. Right behind the door was another, very narrow door, painted in the same color as the wall. Pani Valeska opened it quickly, took out some brooms and that were inside and pushed me in. It fit sideways, and she closed the door. I heard her shoving the rooms up against it, heard running in other parts of the office, and then the sound of her heels on the wooden floor in the corridor. "Is there anyone in the other room, citizen?" "No, officer," said her voice, betraying no tension. The kitchen door was flung open, and the door to my hiding place trembled. I could see them through the crack, a tiny slice of them. I thought my heart would burst. There were two flushed, angry men in uniforms, inches away. "I would never see you again." Panic gripped me and pulled me into the abyss. The policeman moved quickly, looking around the kitchen and out onto the street through the window. "Shit," one of them whispered, banging his fist on the kitchen counter. "All clear," shouted the other one into the corridor. There was a scratching on the door. "You can come out now," said the woman's voice. I didn't know how long I had been in there, listening to the sound of the policemen thundering through the building, banging on the doors, searching the flats and offices, returning to interrogate the man and the woman and to take down their details. And the commotion outside, the screams of the crowds, and then, gradually, the dying down of any sound except for a wailing of sirens. Finally, I heard cars honking and the buzzing of the trams, and then this scratching. The door to my cell opened. They both stood there, a light bulb hanging above their heads, night and the street behind them. I forced my body out of its hiding place, busted myself off, aware of their eyes on me. They had their coats on, and both wore a look of exhaustion and curiosity. "That was very brave of you," said Pani Valeska. "And foolish," said the man, with a hint of smile in his grey eyes. "I know," I said, feeling embarrassed. "Thank you. You saved me." Pani Valeska poured a glass of water and handed it to me. "Yes, that was rather close," said the man, eyeing me. "And an interesting spectacle, too. Those flying papers. What an idea to throw propaganda out there when the whole of the city's police was mobilized in the street. If it hadn't been for us, you would have spent tonight in prison." She smiled, stretching out his hand. "I'm Tomasz Jedrowski, attorney," he said. His hand was large and soft, his fingers like little pincushions. "I'm Ludwig, and this is Pani Valeska, my secretary." We shook hands. "Call me Magozia," she said. "So, what happened?" I asked. They looked at each other. "They dispersed the strikes," said Margosia, hesitantly. Unwillingly almost. "A few people got hurt." "Did anyone die?" "We don't know," said the man, looking at the floor. "Ambulances came and took people away." "Do you think it's safe for me to go out there?" "They might still be looking for you," he said. "Or not, but we'd better not take any risks. We'll take the back entrance. Let's go." We went down the dark stairs very quietly. Before we reached the ground floor, I could hear the noise of passing cars. The entrance door was unhinged, leaning against the wall. We slipped into the long dark corridor that led in the opposite direction, where Pan Tadeusz quickly unlocked the door. We crept into an unlit country yard. There was light in a couple of the windows that faced us, the lamps behind the drawn curtains somehow ominous, like secrets about to be unveiled. We hurried towards the wide trabant, and they made me lie on the back seat. We started, the engine vibrating, my cheek cool against the leather, driving out of the country yard. We flowed into the arteries of the city, inserting ourselves into the body like an unsuspected virus. From below, I watched the houses and monuments rush past, both familiar and new from the perspective. Police sirens howled in the distance, and then the trabant stopped at the mouth of the Block of Visco. "Good night, Ludwig," the man said, turning around me. "Watch out for yourself, and don't push luck."